It all started when Unos finally regained consciousness after 1,000 years of sleeping like a drunk sloth. As he paced around the steel-enforced lab room, his eyes scanned the wreckage of ancient, damaged capsules. Inside one of them, Unos spotted a dead monster, which he assumed must have been one of the failed experimental test subjects. At that moment, Unos began to question why he had been abandoned for 200 years and what must have happened to his family. However, he quickly snapped out of it, realizing that his first priority was to escape the lab and figure out what the hell was going on in the outside world. As he wandered through the lab, Unos stumbled upon the skeletal remains of his colleagues, those who had failed the experiment. The sight left him feeling irritated, but he pushed the emotion aside and continued moving forward. Eventually, Unos reached a massive steel gate leading to the outside world. He knew that for ordinary humans, opening such a barrier would be impossible, but as a monster, it should have been easy peasy. With that thought in mind, Unos clenched his fist and delivered an intense punch to the steel door, expecting it to crumble. Instead, a sharp, searing pain shot through his wrist, sending him rolling on the ground, reeling in pain. It was at that moment he realized that just because he had become a freaky monster didn't mean his punch was as strong as Saitama's. Desperate to leave the underground lab at all costs, Unos reassessed the situation. The lab had clearly been constructed with steel to prevent disgusting creatures like him from escaping. However, Unos quickly remembered that his genes had been enhanced. So, with renewed determination, Unos unleashed his razor-sharp claws and began tearing into the steel door with immense force like some crazy beast of nature. It took effort, but eventually, Unos clawed his way out. Now standing outside, Unos knew he needed a better vantage point to assess his surroundings. So, without wasting any time, he parkoured a nearby mountain, relying on his enhanced Spider-Man climbing skills. Once Unos reached the summit, he immediately activated his eye magnification. Using his hawk eye vision, Unos observed the landscape and was stunned to find himself surrounded by a vast, dense forest. A sense of tension crept in, but before it could fully settle, Unos' body instinctively suppressed the emotion. Unos then recalled that emotional suppression was one of the modifications the crazy Frankensteins had implanted in experimental soldiers, transforming them into living war weapons. Jumping down from the mountain, Unos pressed forward through the thick forest, determined to leave the dense forest. Before long, he stumbled upon an abandoned airship. Curiosity got the better of him, and he cautiously stepped inside. Among the wreckage, he discovered a collection of letters bearing the royal seal of the northern kingdom of Kenan. As he skimmed through them, he discovered that the airship had been attacked by a monster, leading to its catastrophic crash. Even more shocking was the date on the letter. It had been written 200 years ago. With this newfound information, Unos finally understood where he was, a forest deep in the kingdom of Kenan. Stepping out of the ruined ship, Unos made the decision to head east, hoping to find signs of human civilization. However, before he could take another step, a horrible fishy smell worse than your mom's coochie violated his nostrils. Instinctively, Unos clamped a hand over his nose, wondering where the disgusting smell was coming from. Suddenly, he heard rhythmic clapping noises coming from the bush. Peering into the bushes, his eyes widened in sheer disbelief to witness a freaky heat session unfolding between goblins and elves. The sight of the elf baddies being manhandled by those vile creatures sent a wave of irritation and fury coursing through him. Without hesitation, Unos decided he was about to be the ultimate cockblocker. So, he charged straight into the Olympic Games of Sin and obliterated every last one of them freaky goblins into extinction. Meanwhile, in a neighboring village, an ugly simp named Liesel was practically foaming at the mouth, completely mesmerized by the humongous Babylonians of a girl named Dearra. However, Dearra warned that if he didn't secure the bag, he would never get a chance to play with her huge assets. Just then, two other chicks, Gister and Lena, approached the duo. Turning to Liesel, they asked if she was planning to explore the Great Forest, which Liesel confirmed, saying they were absolutely right. Back in the forest, Unos was faced with a giant lizard man, which he literally one-punched like Saitama on a regular day. Afterward, he found meat that had been roasted by the goblins. Having not eaten for 200 years, Unos took a bite of the meat but had an instant spit take because it tasted like it was cooked in the sewers by a blind raccoon. At that moment, Unos realized that after becoming a monster, he must have lost his ability to taste human food. He also remembered that when he woke up to discover he was now a monster, he realized he could no longer speak human language. Still, his only resolve now was to find his way back to human civilization, hoping he might meet his sisters or their descendants. As he pondered, Unos thought about how much he was loving his monster appearance, like he was some demon lord from Overlord, but it could have been perfect if he could at least speak human language to communicate with humans. Putting the language issue aside, Unos, in deep emotion, thought about his empire and whether it had fallen. His homeland, the Floretic Empire, used to be the world's most populated country, boasting sleek, cutting-edge technology. Thanks to this, the empire was able to hold its own against the other 4 countries with which it went to war. These included the Kingdom of Kanon to the north, known for its ability to use both magic and science. To the west was the Einhal Republic, a country filled with elves who worshipped nature. In Uno's mind, monsters were part of nature, so the elves would likely simp for him and accept him. To the east lay the Kingdom of Caesarea, a kingdom with a large number of monsters and an even larger number of monster slayers called exterminators. With this in mind, Unos resolved that, for the time being, it would be best to head to Kanon, hoping he wouldn't bump into any Caesarians along the way who would try to clap him. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the forest, Dearra complained that the only fun activity they ever did as Caesarians was hunt down monsters. However, Liesel tried to encourage her, urging her to stop being such a Debbie Downer. At that point, Lena chimed in, demanding to know what exactly they were searching for in the forest. In response, Liesel suggested it could be a hidden treasure. Excitedly, Lena remarked that exploring the forest felt just like having a picnic. But Liesel quickly pointed out that it was still a dangerous job, warning her to stay sharp and not to let her guard down. Suddenly, Liesel was hit by a massive fireball from nowhere that ended his life instantly, while the girls were attacked by goblins. Seeing Liesel dead, Gister was frozen in shock, and before she could even react, she was grabbed by the legs by the disgusting dwarf goblins. At that moment, a giant pot-bellied ogre showed up, holding a massive log of wood bigger than his second tiny log, and smashed her into mincemeat. Horrified, Gina stayed on the ground, terrified for her life, while Dearra tried to fight back. It was then that she realized that the bunch of goblins, led by an over-bloated ogre, had invaded their hideout. Suddenly, a powerful fireball was launched in her direction, but Dearra summoned an anti-magic shield that was eventually taken down. Desperately, Dearra tried using her magic to protect herself and Lena, but she realized she couldn't. Turning to the side, she noticed in absolute shock that Lena had been mobbed by the crusty goblins. Before she could even react, the goblins jumped at her and immediately began to rip her clothes off. The girls were lying there, helpless, while the goblins did whatever goblins do. Unable to stand the violation, Dearra was about to pull a seppuku move and bite her tongue, but then Unos showed up like a superhero on a mission. Seeing him, the goblins shouted in their language, demanding he get the hell out of their plot arena. However, upon noticing Dearra's 2 massive reasons, Unos chose to stay and began swinging the goblins away from the girls one after the other. Infuriated, the goblin shaman cast a massive fireball at Unos, but the weak attack only massaged Unos' monstrous back. Without hesitation, Unos charged at the shaman, grabbed his head, and smashed it into a rock, like a Mortal Kombat fatality move, while Dearra, holding Lena, could only watch in amazement. Enraged, the mighty ogre, clutching its massive log of doom, stood to challenge Unos. Seeing the big guy as a worthy opponent, Unos decided to give the fight a try. At that moment, the ogre leapt into the sky and smashed its log onto Unos' head. However, this only felt like a mosquito bite to Unos, and in retaliation, Unos drove his fist into the ogre's pot belly, sending the extra-large monster crashing into the wall. Not stopping there, Unos leapt mid-air and, in a savage move, pulverized the fat ogre into nothing but blood and meat smoothie. Glancing back at the girls, Unos tried to assure them they were safe and didn't need to fear him, but the language barrier made him sound more like a weird anime dub. As thanks for saving their lives, Unos collected Dearra's sword, but she shouted, begging him to take anything else, even her dignity, except her sword. Still, the language barrier made it impossible for Unos to understand her pleas. As Unos began to leave with the sword, Dearra kept shouting that without it, her team had no proof of existence. Seeing Unos was almost gone with the sword, Dearra shouted at the top of her lungs, warning him that she would chase him to the ends of the earth to retrieve her sword. Later that night, Unos sat by the fireplace. As he examined the sword he got from Dearra, he realized it was a magic sword capable of consuming magic power. Not only that, but the sword could also penetrate even his impenetrable skin. Just then, his thoughts drifted to the hot Dearra and how much those bouncy babies on her chest captivated him. He couldn't help but hope he would get to see her again someday. Meanwhile, at the boundary between the town and the forest, Dearra informed Lena that she was determined to retrieve her sword. Fearful of losing her, Lena hugged Dearra tightly and begged her not to meet a brutal end like Liesel and Gister had. Despite Lena's heartfelt pleas, Dearra remained resolute and left, leaving Lena overwhelmed with emotion. Back to our favorite monster, Unos found himself restless as the night dragged on. Sleep eluded him, and to make matters worse, his taste buds had turned against him. Everything he ate tasted bland and saltless, leaving him deeply unsatisfied. Desperate for a decent meal, Unos decided to venture out in search of a human town. As dawn approached, Unos stumbled upon an abandoned town. At its entrance, he spotted an anti-aircraft gun. At the sight of the weapon, a flashback invaded his head, specifically, how his empire had used such weapons to defeat the winged monsters during the war. Shaking off the memories, Unos reasoned that the town's lack of high exterior walls likely meant it was an inner town. Suddenly, a traumatizing stench smelling worse than Satan's armpits assaulted his nostrils. Unos immediately recognized the repulsive odor as the unmistakable stench of those vile, useless goblins. Venturing deeper into the town, Unos wasn't surprised to find a group of ugly goblins playing volleyball with human skulls. Disgusted and enraged, he charged at the smelly creatures, decimating them left, right, and center. However, 3 goblins managed to escape. Noticing they fled in the same direction, Unos suspected something fishy was afoot and decided to chase after them. As he pursued the fleeing goblins, Unos observed that their movements seemed coordinated, as if they were being controlled by something or someone. His chase led him to what appeared to be a school. Inside, the nauseating stench grew even stronger, nearly making him vomit his intestines. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw next. As Unos entered the main building, he was shocked to his core. There, lying on a bed, was an ugly Lizzo goblin, surrounded by a horde of nasty goblins. This fat goblin was none other than the Goblin Queen, the ultimate breeding factory. In a single day, this shapeless, fatty queen could reproduce up to 34 goblins, meaning that as long as she existed, the number of foul-smelling goblins would continue to grow exponentially. Wasting no time, Unos lunged at the queen, but midway, the smaller goblins mobbed him, desperately trying to protect their queen mother. Unfazed, Unos dismissed them as small fries and went berserk, sending the little goblins flying in all directions. With the little gremlins dealt with, Unos turned his attention to the queen. But the swole Goblin Queen was so filthy that Unos refused to get within 10 feet of her. Instead, Unos picked up a stone and, like a javelin thrower at the Olympics, hurled it directly at the queen. The stone struck her fat hand, tearing it off. Although Unos had aimed for her head, Unos quickly grabbed another stone and launched it again. This time, the stone hit its mark, blowing a massive hole large enough to fit your big head in her squishy stomach. Unos then cleared the last of the goblins standing in front and, finally, took her head off. With his body now reeking worse than a dumpster behind a seafood restaurant, Unos decided to find a nearby river to wash off the stench. Desperate to wash off the stank, he went looking for a river, but instead, he stumbled upon the town's shopping mall. Without hesitation, Unos entered, grabbed a backpack, and filled it with useful items: a frying pan, some home appliances, and finally, a stash of canned foods. As he packed, Unos also remembered to gather newspapers and magazines related to his empire. Through these, Unos discovered that, 200 years ago, his empire had lost the war to the city of Einhell after their western front collapsed. Despite this sad revelation, Unos remained fixated on one burning question: what had happened on May 25, 1667? After scouring the newspapers from that date, he learned that, in a last-ditch effort to turn the tide of the war, his empire had deployed its ultimate trump card. Concerned, Unos wondered if the empire had still been destroyed despite using the trump card. The only way to find out was to travel to the imperial capital someday. Motivated by this thought, Unos decided that the next day, he would head to a place called Luke Dill, a town near the border of Canaan. From there, he could assess the state of the imperial city. Meanwhile, elsewhere, a mercenary named Orlando was approached by the head of the mercenaries, Arngale, who tasked him with eliminating the goblin den in Luke Dill. After a brief moment of consideration, Orlando agreed, promising to clean up the entire place, but only for a befitting reward, of course. The following morning, Unos woke up to start his journey to Luke Dill, only to realize that he had slept like a drunk sloth on a Sunday the night before. From this, he figured that his body only went to sleep when he was truly exhausted. Similarly, he noticed that he only felt hungry after exhausting his strength in battle. Sometime later, Unos finally arrived at Luke Dill, but as he approached, he suddenly noticed a bunch of goblins fleeing frantically outside the town's gates. Surprised, Unos wondered if the goblins were in conflict with the Canon people. Curious to investigate, he activated his cloaking ability to hide himself from everyone's sight. Once inside the city, Unos was shocked to see 50 members of the army surrounded by an enormous horde of goblins. These soldiers were Orlando and his team, who were clearly at a disadvantage against the overwhelming number of enemies. Despite the odds, Unos could tell that Orlando was a skilled commander who knew what he was doing. Orlando and his team fought fiercely, refusing to hold back even as they were clearly outnumbered. Their determination paid off, and before long, the enormous crowd of goblins was annihilated in the blink of an eye. After the battle, Orlando instructed the team's mage, Caseta, to use his magic to search for survivors. As Caseta cast a wide-range spell to scan the area, Unos, who was hiding behind a boulder, began to feel itchy. Worried that his cover had been blown, Unos took off running. At that moment, Caseta alerted Orlando that a monster was on the move, prompting Orlando to order his team to pursue it immediately. In an attempt to escape, Unos began parkouring through buildings while Orlando and his team chased after him. Realizing they needed to stop the monster, Caseta summoned a wall of fire that completely surrounded Unos, cutting off his escape. With no way out, Orlando finally caught up to him, pointing his sword at Unos as a challenge to a duel. Though Unos wasn't in the mood to fight a human, he decided to engage, knowing they might not show him the same mercy. As Unos began to emit a blazing aura, Orlando was petrified to his core. Recognizing the danger, Orlando quickly ordered the rookies on his team to fall back, declaring that the monster was nothing like the goblins they had just fought. Following his command, the rookies retreated, allowing the archers and mages to take the front lines. They launched a barrage of fire and arrows at Unos, but his thick hide deflected every attack, leaving Orlando and his team stunned. Desperate to land a hit, one of the soldiers attempted to impale Unos with his spear as if he were hunting some stupid boar. However, Unos reacted swiftly, delivering a powerful uppercut to the fartknocker's jaw and sending him crashing to the ground. Orlando was enraged after the attack on his team member, so he yeeted himself into the sky. But when he swung his sword at Unos, Bro just swatted it away like he was playing badminton, shocking Orlando and causing his team to whisper in disbelief that the monster had deflected the captain's sword with its bare hand. At this point, Orlando stood frozen, staring at Unos in fear of the fearsome creature. Meanwhile, Annie, the team's blonde combatant, on seeing that Orlando was struggling against the monster, dashed past him toward Unos, despite Orlando shouting at her to retreat. Unos, being the simp lord he is, got a nosebleed the second he saw Annie running at him. But he wasn't about to let her clap him, so he tried to strike first. Annie skillfully dodged his attack and whipped out her bow, firing an arrow straight at his face. Surprisingly, Unos caught the arrow with his mouth, leaving Orlando and his team watching in utter disbelief. Unos then grabbed Annie with his giant monstrous hand and, like a creepy simp, began to measure the size of her well-rounded melons. Desperate to escape his cultured grip, Annie slipped free, accidentally removing her top in the process and revealing her well-shaped milk bags in 1080p. Distracted by Annie's plots, Unos failed to notice Orlando seizing the opportunity to order his team to attack together. As they launched their assault, Unos decided not to harm them, partly for the sake of Annie's OnlyFans content, and effortlessly deflected all their attacks. Orlando tried to land a strike with his blade, but Unos blocked it with his hand once again, pushing Orlando backwards. Annie, still determined to win the fight, lunged at Unos with a magic sword, and this time she managed to slash him across the waist, causing blood to spill. For a moment, she smiled triumphantly, but her victory was short-lived as Unos's injury healed almost instantly, leaving both her and Orlando completely stunned. As Orlando's Delulu team surrounded Unos, they finally realized that this was a monster far beyond their capabilities. Not wanting to risk the lives of his team, Orlando decided to sacrifice himself to ensure their escape. He thought it best to act as a distraction, though he wondered how long he could last against such a foe. While he was still contemplating the situation, Unos stepped forward and pointed his finger at Orlando. At that moment, Orlando was shocked as he deduced that Unos was signaling for him to save everyone by sacrificing himself. Without hesitation, Orlando ordered the rest of the team to retreat, explaining that the monster wanted a one-on-one fight with him. Concerned, Annie shouted at Orlando, telling him not to be a fool and to play the hero because he couldn't win. However, Orlando snapped back, asking her to shut her pie hole and cover up her exposed milk bags. With tears in her eyes, Annie called him an idiot and begged him not to engage the monster. Still, Orlando turned away from her, stating that he was fully aware he was too weak and useless to face the monster. But as long as none of his teammates died, he was willing to sacrifice himself. With that said, Orlando grabbed the hilt of his sword and resolved to send his teammates back alive, even if it meant giving up his own life. At that moment, he raised his sword to the sky, ready to launch an attack, while the rest of his team could only watch in fear. However, before Orlando could even begin his strike, Unos charged in at twice the speed of Flash and grabbed Orlando's hand mid-air. To the team's utter shock, Unos lifted Orlando like a toy while Orlando desperately tried, in a last-ditch effort, to grab his second blade, though his hand was already bleeding profusely. While suspended in the air like a fly, the team screamed in fear, bracing themselves to witness Unos chew off their captain's head. But suddenly, Unos spat in disgust, yeeting Orlando to the ground, as the horrible smell emanating from Orlando's hair was worse than Shrek's mushy underside. Orlando stood up, demanding to know what had just happened, while his team, embarrassed, asked Orlando when he had last washed his disgusting hair. Orlando replied sheepishly, admitting he hadn't washed his hair since birth. Having survived entering Nirvana from the bacteria-infested hair, Unos decided to leave and moved into the forest, where he strongly perceived the smell of blood. Concerned, he decided to investigate where the smell was coming from. Following the nasty smell, Unos stumbled upon a horrifying sight: corpses mutilated everywhere. As he observed the scene, he noticed that the carnage wasn't the work of a monster, but of bandits, as the victims' personal belongings had also been stolen. Determined to pursue justice, Unos decided to follow the trail left behind by the carriage like a bloodhound on a mission. After running at full speed, Unos suddenly spotted the carriage in the distance. As he charged toward it, the bandits realized a literal monster was chasing them and immediately fled, abandoning the carriage. Unos, curious about what was inside, decided to investigate. Upon opening it, he froze to find 5 unclad, terrified girls with their chesticles on full display. Being a milkman at heart, Unos took a moment to enjoy the censored view before deciding to chase after the bandits, who were likely planning to sell the girls at their hideout. After mentally capturing the girls' plots for some hand-pumping later, Unos closed the carriage curtain and refocused on his mission. Determined to find the bandits, Unos activated his heightened sense of smell, like a police dog, and tracked their scent to a nearby cave. Without wasting any time, Unos turned on his cloaking ability and stealthily entered the cave. Inside, he noticed that the place was surprisingly neat. As he moved deeper, he discovered a prison filled with skeletons and malnourished children, which infuriated him to no end. Declaring that the bandits deserved no mercy, Unos pressed on. Deep inside the cave, Unos began to hear the voice of one of the bandits apologizing to their boss for abandoning the carriage. Unos found this strangely sus, as he normally couldn't understand human language. At that moment, he began to doubt whether the bandits or their boss were even human. At the end of the path, Unos noticed a very short door, fit only for Kevin Hart on a tricycle. Due to his enormous size, Unos couldn't enter normally. Taking a step back, Unos charged at the door, blowing it to smithereens. Inside, he found the boss, a monstrosity with a human face and the body of an overfed spider, strangling a man with one of its claws. What surprised Unos even more was when the monster, upon seeing Unos, demanded to know if he was the one who had kidnapped the girls it had taken. Hearing the monster speak Ferlitos, the language of monsters, Unos put 2 and 2 together and assumed that the creature must be just like him, an experimental soldier created by his empire. Meanwhile, back at the governor's office, Arngale summoned Orlando and demanded to know why a grown man would choose not to bathe and smell like a trailer park hobo. However, feeling utterly embarrassed, Orlando quickly changed the subject and chose to report on the mission instead. He explained to the governor that, although they had successfully eliminated the goblins, they had encountered a monster that took out 7 of his men without them even landing a single hit. Furthermore, Orlando informed an already frightened Arngale that his team were completely defeated by the gray-colored monster with a tail, who was not only incredibly strong, but also highly intelligent. Shocked and curious, Arngale asked Orlando if even his Titan Slayer blade had failed to defeat the monster. Orlando confirmed this, stating that he couldn't land a single strike with his blade. Orlando added that to deal with such a monster, he would need a new, high-quality sword and the assistance of a high-ranking mage. Hearing this, Arngale assigned the task of dealing with the monster to Orlando, who proudly vowed to do his best. Still, Arngale couldn't shake his unease, blurting out that it would be disastrous if another mutated monster were to appear. However, Orlando shut him down immediately, urging him not to be pessimistic. Back at the cave, while Unos was trying to figure out if the spider-like creature was truly one of the Empire's experimented soldiers, the spider monster took advantage of his distraction and entangled him in its webs. With Unos immobilized, the spider creature taunted him, calling him a low-budget Hulk and ordering him not to struggle, as escape was impossible. Shortly, the spider monster grew emotional, revealing that the reason he had abducted the girls was his desperate attempt to get his deformed, millimeter-sized Peter working again, though his efforts had been in vain. This confirmed Unos' theory that the spider creature was indeed an experimented soldier like him, as Unos also struggled with a useless dangling stick. The spider monster went on to explain that he had even tried having both mothers and children give him lap dances, but still, his rod would not stand in attention. Frustrated, the creature burst into hysterical laughter, sounding like a deranged clown. However, in that brief moment of distraction, Unos managed to free himself from the webs and launched an attack. Yet, the spider monster sidestepped effortlessly, evading the strike. Unos understood the anger of losing one's ability to perform, but he refused to accept it as a justification for becoming a villain. Determined, Unos attacked again, but the spider monster continued to prove elusive. At one point, the creature tried blasting Unos with webs, but instead, the webs hit one of his own men. Throughout the fight, Unos aimed to grab the spider monster by its tiny waist and crush it completely. Finally, he succeeded in grabbing the creature, thinking it was surely the end. However, to his surprise, the spider monster shed its skin and slipped out of his grip, leaving Unos holding nothing but a pile of spider skin. The shed skin was poisonous and began to burn Unos' palm, causing him to fall to his knees in excruciating pain. Seeing Unos incapacitated, the spider monster laughed victoriously and, to cement his triumph, vomited acid on him. Unos lay on the ground, defeated and unable to move a single muscle. But in that moment of despair, Unos remembered the healing potion he had collected from Dearra. Unsure of its effects on monsters, but with no other options, Unos retrieved the potion from his backpack and poured it onto his numb hand. To his surprise, the pain and numbness began to fade, and shortly after, he felt completely healed, all thanks to the busty Dearra, whose creamy potion had saved his life. In the next scene, Unos was found just outside the cave, grateful after surviving a life-threatening situation. Now revitalized, even though he had no intention of playing a superhero, Unos couldn't overlook innocent women being used as objects in some creepy maniac's quest for creamy comfort. Determined to act, Unos activated his overpowered sense of smell and began tracing the disgusting scent of the unhinged insect man. Meanwhile, on a narrow dusty path leading to town, Spider Creep noticed an unclad baddie riding a carriage, and all he wanted was for the girl to ride him that way. Just as he thought about capturing the hottie, Unos hurled a stone in his direction. However, the spider mutant dodged the stone matrix style, causing it to smack into the tree behind him. Seeing Unos, Spider-Man was shocked, as he never believed the Ben Grimm would survive his acid poison. Annoyed that his chance of getting his nuggets gobbled had slipped away, Spider-Man moved to suffocate Unos with his webs. But just then, he noticed that Unos was maintaining the 6-foot distance rule of 2020. On the other hand, Unos, trying to prevent the webs from entangling him again, picked up stones to use as weapons, just as he had done with the goblin mother earlier. Frustrated by the distance, Spider-Man charged at Unos, but Unos simply retreated, creating even more space between them. Unos hurled one of the stones with precision, aiming for Spider-Man's jump. However, Spider-Man sidestepped, evading the attack. Still frustrated at not being able to use his webs effectively, Spider-Man tried to close the distance again, but Unos continued to retreat with every advance. This time, Spider-Man attempted to use his acid poison, but Unos leapt high, using a tree as a shield. With that, Unos continued his strategy, retreating whenever Spider-Man closed in, using trees to remove any entangling threads, and counterattacking with stones. This back and forth went on for days, leaving Spider-Man weary and exhausted. With his head spinning from hunger and thirst, Spider-Man began to see doubles, giving Unos the perfect opportunity to land a decisive strike finally. Unos pummeled heavy stones at Spider-Man, shattering every part of his body until the creature collapsed to the ground, unable to move a muscle. Unos then approached Spider-Man, grabbed his bony head, and ripped his upper region from his large abdomen. Savagely, Unos dragged Spider-Man's head, along with his spinal cord, and smacked it against a tree. In his final moments, Spider-Man realized that Unos had been speaking for Litos all along. Desperate, Spider-Man began begging for mercy, pleading that they were both experimented soldiers. However, it was too late. Unos was already set on sending him to the great beyond. Without hesitation, Unos crushed Spider-Man's head like a watermelon, ending the insect man instantly. Weeks later, after defeating the spider monster, Unos traveled to Einhal City, the country of the Elves. This decision came after he first returned to his empire, Canaan, only to discover that his homeland had abandoned science. Instead, as a means of frontline defense against invasions from neighboring countries, the Canaan Empire had equipped their walls with the highest-grade weapons known as ballista. Despite this, Unos found himself disinterested in his country, as the city appeared shabby and rundown after losing its former glory. As a result, his new place of interest became Einhal City, where he hoped to find the famously beautiful elven girls. After staying for a few days, he also learned that the elven people were experts in magic, capable of performing spells without even using incantations. However, the real attraction wasn't their magical prowess. It was their girls, who were hotter than Kylie Jenner. These Instagram-worthy models were so stunning that Unos spent most of his time patrolling the river area just to watch them flaunt their clappers and slappers. Among the hundreds of spicy elven girls, one particular curvy rosebud, whom Unos nicknamed Baddie Number 6, stood out as the one our boy would love to make finger love to. This girl packed more cakes behind her than a rich white girl's birthday party. Every time this beauty was around, especially when she was with some mischievous kids, Unos would hide behind the bushes, watching with one hand stroking his ball-deficient rod. Often, these nasty kids would playfully fling her skirt up, exposing her curvy softness, or grab her melons, all under the pretext of innocent play. Watching Baddie Number 6 leave, Unos was entirely satisfied, but soon, another chick caught his attention, an elf with dumplings the size of your head. This girl had been nicknamed by Unos as Baddie Number 8, and she was the most terrifying and captivating of all the elven chicks. Unos was particularly interested in her because of the enormous size of her juice bags. Baddie Number 8 always had 2 attendants beside her whenever she came to the stream, which suggested that she might be someone of significant status in the country. Furthermore, this girl rarely opened her eyes, which Unos found even more intriguing. Whenever she bathed in the river, her movements radiated elegance that made the rest of the girls in the kingdom look like extras. Because of this, Unos never missed an opportunity to stare at her and immerse himself in watching everything she did. However, the obvious problem was that even after binging on her jiggly flicks, Unos still couldn't satisfy his cultured desires, thanks to his missing balls. At that moment, he remembered the Spidey monster, of blessed memory, and all the struggles the guy had endured due to a lack of steamy activities. Unos could now understand why the insect dude had gone raving villain mad after years of such emptiness. Unos couldn't help but feel a little sympathy for the guy and couldn't shake the fear that one day he, too, might end up just as cold and bitter as the spider. But whenever Unos got moody, his body's emotional suppression ability kicked in, preventing him from dwelling on things that couldn't be changed. As the day turned to night, Unos knew the elves wouldn't come to the river after dark, so he decided to use the time to gather some supplies. After roasting a deer he had caught in the forest, he chopped it into tiny pieces using his magic sword. But, as usual, the flavorless meat wasn't hitting without salt, so he left dinner half-finished. Even late at night, Unos still couldn't sleep. He kept rolling from one side to the other until he finally stood up. Thinking it would be best, he searched for more test experimental subjects like himself in the imperial capital. So the following morning, Unos reflected on how, even though the imperial capital was in disarray, it still had the potential to recover. He realized he couldn't continue staying in the elven village, watching elven girls bathe like a creep. With that, he decided it would be best to head to the imperial capital. He hung his backpack on his back and set off on his journey. Even though his mind continued to linger on thoughts of leaving Baddie Number 6 and 8 behind, he brushed it off and pressed on. Meanwhile, Dearra was haunted by memories of her childhood, particularly the time she was molested by the old, weak-chinned twit who was supposed to be her magic guardian. Even though most nights she felt disgusted and wished she could just go home, the creepy shrink of a man continued to abuse her. In the present, as she walked through the deserted forest, these painful memories resurfaced, reminding her of the time she had been used as a toy. Soon, Dearra entered the kingdom of Canaan. As she walked down the street, she overheard people whispering about a monster, Curious, she approached one of the girls who had been saved in the carriage incident a while back and handed her a silver coin in exchange for information. The girl asked Dearra what she wanted to know, and Dearra replied that she wanted to hear everything about what had happened that day. With that, the girl opened up, explaining that on the day they were kidnapped and taken to the kidnappers' hideout in a carriage, a monster suddenly appeared and caused chaos. Seeing the monster, their kidnappers immediately fled, leaving them behind. She added that the monster didn't harm them, but simply stared intently at them inside the carriage before eventually leaving. However, the monster returned almost immediately, stared again for a while, and then left once more. The girl also revealed that, based on her female intuition, she was certain the monster's cultured gaze had been fixated on their bouncy globes. Still, she assured Dearra that the monster had done no harm and had simply left in a hurry. After sharing her story, the girl remarked that Dearra was quite busty herself and joked that she wouldn't mind if Dearra came to her place if she ever needed money. Dearra smiled, thanked her, and then left. As she continued strolling through the city, Dearra felt an overwhelming sense that the monster was nearby in Canaan. Along the way, she stumbled upon some adventurers talking about the money they had made from hunting. This triggered another wave of past memories for Dearra. She recalled how, despite being abused at a young age, she had trained hard to become a full-fledged mage. Yet, her hometown was eventually ravaged by monsters, and everyone she had ever known was gone. In that moment of despair, Dearra nearly lost her mind. To regain her sanity, she became an adventurer, hunting down monsters relentlessly, even at the risk of her own life. Her sole motivation was her determination to erase the existence of monsters from the world. It was during this time that she met Liesel and Lena, who asked her to team up with them as adventurers. She agreed, and later, Gister joined the group. Together, they shared hardships, joys, and near-death experiences. Before long, they successfully took down a goblin hideout, and it was during this mission that Liesel found the magic sword. Liesel then entrusted the sword to Dearra for safekeeping, as she was the leader of the squad. This temporary group of adventurers became Dearra's family and her home. But, as always, monsters took that family away from her, too. The magic sword that Unos now carried was a symbol of her lost family, and Dearra was determined to reclaim it, no matter the cost. Remembering how Lena had begged her to return safely, Dearra, still strolling through the city, vowed to retrieve her sword and return to Lena. On the other hand, Unos continued his journey, heading southeast to the imperial capital. Along the way, he stumbled into the wreckage of a ruined town, a town he recognized from past travels, once close to the imperial city but now reduced to rubble. Shocked, he wondered if the elves were responsible for such a major disaster. All night, Unos kept running toward the imperial city. Even when exhaustion threatened to overtake him, he refused to stop, pushing himself relentlessly. After running for what felt like an eternity, he finally reached an iron tower. This tower, built by the Imperial Empire years ago, stood as a testament to the Empire's impressive technological prowess in the past. As Unos gazed at it, memories flooded back, memories of when he was still human and had brought his family to see the tower for the first time. However, as he stood there, lost in thought, Unos suddenly heard goblin voices. Turning around, he realized he had been surrounded by a countless number of filthy little goblins. Surprisingly, Unos smiled. He had been so moody lately, and this was the perfect opportunity to blow off some steam. By sunrise, the scene was gruesome. Millions of goblins lay mutilated, their body parts scattered across the ground like dead flies. After exterminating them like roaches, Unos decided it was time to move on to the next town. Hours of running later, Unos spotted another ruin in the distance. A feeling of dread crept into his chest as he approached. Unlike the other towns he had encountered, which were overrun by greenery, this one was eerily covered in ash. As he drew closer, Unos realized the ash wasn't some aesthetic choice of wall paint. It was the result of the town being completely incinerated, confirming his fear. Unos couldn't help but wonder if the elves were responsible for this level of destruction, even if they were at war. Then again, he considered whether this massive explosion could have been caused by the ultimate weapon his own country had deployed. Growing increasingly worried, Unos charged toward the capital, desperate to see what had become of the Imperial Empire. However, after running for a while, Unos suddenly stopped mid-stride. Deep down, he had been lying to himself, denying the truth that had been right in front of him all along. The imperial capital was no more. Instead, a massive crater stretched before him, a gaping wound in the earth. As Unos stepped onto the crater, he tried to comprehend the sheer scale of destruction and questioned what kind of explosives could have caused such a disaster of unimaginable scale. For the first time, he understood why the neighboring land of Kanon had rejected science altogether. This devastation was the final form of unchecked technological ambition. Standing on what was once his homeland, Unos felt the weight of every decision his empire had made. They had believed in progress, believed in war, but at what cost? As reality set in, Unos couldn't help but question whether his nation's decision to go to war had been its greatest mistake all along. After confirming that his empire had been completely annihilated, Unos returned to the Einhell kingdom to continue his creepy obsession with peeping on elves while they bathed. He couldn't stop thirsting over their super thick bodies, though he knew deep down that he was simply running away from reality. Just then, a thought crept into his mind. He wondered if, despite his empire's destruction, there was still a mentally deranged scientist out there who could turn him back into a human. However, after some deep reflection, Unos dismissed the idea as mere wishful thinking. Even though he appreciated his monstrous form, a part of Unos still longed to be human again, if only to escape the loneliness that haunted him. Just as his mental strain was about to reach its limit, Unos felt a flicker of gratitude. Though he didn't have a partner, at least his baddie number 8 could keep him sane simply by staring at her extra-large bungas. If he couldn't return to being human, Unos decided it was best to accept his fate as a monster. After all, even as a monster, he believed he could still find enjoyment in life. He just had to work toward it. But there was one major problem: the food. Every time he tried to eat, the taste was bland and lacking salt. Unos concluded that to truly enjoy eating, he needed salt. However, as a monster, he couldn't simply walk into a store and purchase it. He would have to steal it. With that decision made, Unos resolved to head to Kanon to acquire some salt by any means necessary. Meanwhile, in Kanon, Orlando's head was about to explode. A blond man named Edward stood before him, scolding him for his inability to read. Feeling embarrassed, Orlando retorted that he could at least write his name. Edward, unimpressed, pointed out that while everyone else had been studying, Orlando had spent his time binge watching the hub while jacking off like a fool. Holding up a document, Edward sighed and remarked that since they didn't have years to wait for Orlando to learn how to read, he'd just read the important parts to him. After reading the report, Orlando placed his hand on his chin, stunned. The document revealed that Unos, the monster, had single-handedly destroyed the goblin colony, including the goblin mother. Orlando quickly deduced that with the level of threat Unos posed, it was only a matter of time before the monster caused even more destruction to human society. If that were the case, Orlando assured Edward that the bounty on the monster's head would increase, and his team would be the ones to claim the reward after eliminating him. But Edward immediately shuts Orlando up by warning that first, he actually had to eliminate the monster. Edward then reported that to combat this new species of monster, the team had purchased sharp swords, but the cost was draining their funds. Orlando, placing his hand on his chin, pointed out that even with the new weapons, they would still need a skilled mage. Edward quickly informed him that there was a severe shortage of excellent mages in the kingdom, which frustrated Orlando. Orlando stated that all he wanted was a hot mage who didn't charge too much and had jizz-worthy chesticles. Hearing this, Edward smirked and said he would relay the request to Annie, but Orlando froze and begged him not to tell her about their conversation. Edward, ever the opportunist, replied, saying if Orlando didn't want Annie to know, he'd have to bribe him with a bottle of 2000-year-old wine from the tavern. Orlando was shocked at hearing this but reluctantly agreed. Just then, Annie and the rest of the team walked in, demanding to know what was going on. True to his jerk nature, Edward didn't waste any time announcing that Orlando was giving them all a treat. Meanwhile, back with Unos, on his way to Kanon, he bumped into a group of frightened bandits who had just murdered some merchants and were about to steal their caravan. What angered Unos even more was the sight of a pretty girl lying in a pool of her own blood, with her average-sized melons molested. The horrific scene infuriated Unos to no end. Just then, he noticed that the ragtag squad of bandits had surrounded him, ready to attack. With his anger already boiling, Unos didn't hesitate. Using his powerful fist, he turned one of the bandits' heads into nothing but mincemeat with a single punch. The other bandits, witnessing this, tried to flee, but Unos was relentless. He savagely impaled one from behind with his fist and followed up with a brutal kick to the back of another. The last bandit, trembling like a leaf and nearly wetting himself, cowered on the ground, and at that moment, Unos recalled his busty mentor's advice: always get on people's nerves. So, without hesitation, he punted the bandit's head like a ball, sending blood spewing from the neck. After this brutal annihilation, Unos felt a pang of regret. They were humans, after all. However, he quickly consoled himself with the thought that the bandits had taken innocent lives and deserved their fate. As compensation for dealing with the bandits, Unos took 2 jars of salt from the merchant's caravan. The thought of finally being able to season his meat properly and cook the variety of dishes he loved filled him with joy, more joy than a fat kid seeing a burger. He also picked up a water jug from the caravan, intrigued by its elaborate design and the assumption that it was more expensive than your cheap haircut. However, upon realizing the jug had a hole at the bottom and was more useless than a lifeguard at the Olympics, he decided to discard it. As Unos relaxed on the ground, he began thinking about finding a proper container for his salt. Reflecting on his recent travels, he realized he had been going back and forth between Canaan, the Empire, and Einhol far too often. It dawned on him that establishing a proper base in the Empire would make his movements much easier. The idea of a secret hideout stocked with essentials near the border of Einhol and Canaan excited him. So, after some thought, Unos decided to start building his secret base as soon as possible. So, the following morning, Unos set off toward his homeland, carrying a jar of salt with him. As he approached a place called Idris, he noticed something strange in the bushes. The object had a bright color, making him wonder if it was an artifact. With the trees obstructing his view, Unos decided to move closer for a better look. Moving closer to the target, Unos discovered a secret facility eerily similar to the one he had woken up in. Staring at the building brought back nightmare memories of the painful experiments he had endured. Meanwhile, at the fortress in the former Imperial territory, Dearra was hired as a mercenary mage by the Canaan soldiers and found herself facing off against goblins that had taken over the wall. This wall once belonged to the Canaan people, but was occupied by the Imperial Empire. Dearra had accepted the job as a mercenary mage primarily because the pay was good and also because she was a brokey, having spent all her money crossing the border into Canaan. Life hadn't been easy for her. On the streets, random idiots would often approach her, on the assumption that she was some sloth from Goonies, and ask for the price of spending the night with her. This infuriated Dearra to no end, and she would usually retort by telling them to spend the night with their hands and some lotion instead. Despite her sharp tongue, the men couldn't seem to take their sultry eyes off her pipe-tingling face and her massive milk factory. The next day, the battlefield was pure chaos. The goblins launched a fierce attack, taking out one of the soldiers with a well-aimed stone to his stupid face. As the battle intensified, Dearra, alongside a group of mages, launched an enormous fireball at the goblins on the wall, obliterating most of them. Orlando, who was also present on the battlefield with his squad, couldn't help but notice how impressive Dearra's magic was. During a brief rest, Orlando tried to stylishly flirt with Dearra, but due to his Jerry-level riz, his charm was as effective as a wet matchstick. As time passed, eventually, the goblins began to lose steam. The Canaan forces secured the outer wall, burst through the fortress gate, and Orlando, being the best swordsman, annihilated the Goblin Queen and the remaining goblins. The battle ended with minimal casualties on the Canaan side, resulting in a decisive victory and the reclaiming of the fortress. After the battle, Orlando approached Dearra, commending her for her impressive magical display. He introduced himself as the leader of the Daybreak Battlefield group and expressed his desire to hire her for his team. He explained that they would soon be called upon for an extermination mission against a new species of monster, and that he was in dire need of a skilled and reliable mage. Hearing about the monster, Dearra didn't hesitate. She told him to say less and agreed instantly to join his team. Meanwhile, Unos, still observing the facility, noticed a hole melting through the outer wall. Using this as an entry point, he slipped inside. Once inside, he also observed that the elevator carbon was melting, which made him wonder what could be causing such intense heat. Just then, he spotted loose web threads scattered throughout the facility. This led him to assume that the facility might be the secret base of the clapped spider mutant. After descending in the cramped elevator, Unos found a gate left wide open. Surprisingly, he could hear faint sounds of movement. Taking his time to investigate, he realized the noise was coming from a generator. He also discovered that the facility had equipment capable of generating a small amount of electricity using groundwater. Scanning the abandoned facility, Unos noticed that the building had a sturdy ceiling and, even better, a working electricity supply. This made it the perfect location for his secret base, and the thought filled him with excitement. Hours later, after stocking his jar of salt on a shelf in the facility, Unos decided to head back to Einhell to gather more supplies. However, it wasn't long before the cultured schmuck found himself peeping at baddie number 2 from the bushes. As usual, the mischievous brats were having a field day playing with the girl's assets. They filled their hands with her insanely huge pillows and even removed her plot armor whenever they got the chance, all under the guise of playing. Unos, hidden in the bushes, couldn't get enough of the rated R scene. At that moment, he reasoned that it might be a good idea to establish some kind of relationship with the elves. After all, elves had incredibly long lifespans, and by forming a connection with them, he could learn more about what had happened 200 years ago during the war. However, there was one major problem he needed to solve first: how to get the elves to understand the gibberish he was saying. At the same time, in the Canon Kingdom, Arngale was glancing over a document with a displeased expression when a knock on the door startled him. A scrawny-looking man named Marcus, the leader of the Mercury mercenary group, walked in and immediately demanded to know why Arngale looked so troubled. Arngale explained that an extermination order had been issued by the king, and it was supposed to be a joint operation with the local army. Marcus, unimpressed, replied that he didn't see the point of the order since the monster had only attacked some useless bandits who had assaulted a merchant. Arngale, growing angrier, pointed out that it was the king's direct order. He added that the monster had also stolen an item called the replica of water sources, which was supposed to be the symbol for a new town being developed. Frustrated, Arngale banged his fist on the table, exclaiming that the stolen jar was no reason to risk their lives fighting an unknown enemy. He further argued that even if they joined forces with the local army and succeeded, the army would likely take all the credit. The old geezer, trying to calm Arngale down, assured him that he had done well protecting the interests of the mercenaries. However, he made it clear that his team would not be involved in the matter. As the captain of the Mercury mercenary group, Marcus stated firmly that he would not risk the lives of his team members over a threat they knew nothing about. Will the local army of Canon succeed in annihilating Unos, and will Dearra finally get to retrieve her sword? Comment cultured monster if you're eager to find out in our part 2. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. As always, thanks for watching.